So welcome to Chile, Sidney, and
thank you.
You're visiting the country in a very special moment in the country's history, actually. In fact, we live in what we could call, the aftermath of a major protest wave, which took place in 2011. And as you know, after having read a vast amount of papers on the topic, I guess, this protest wave was led by the student movement, but other social movement organizations also joined. And the political dynamics that follow this protest wave have introduced a lot of uncertainty, for sure, in terms of what will happen, what will come out of this political process, in terms of concrete policies, in terms of political realignments between parties, between social movements and parties, and so on. So the aim of this interview is to reflect on your intellectual trajectory and the way in which your scholarly contribution can help us to shed light or make sense of the current political moment in Chile. So in relation to that, of particular interest, of course, is a topic that has been at the very heart of your research, which is the relationship between social movements and institutional terrain. But there have, however, been shifts in this trajectory, right? And you've gone, if you could, summarize it, you've gone from a more structurally oriented approach to social movement research to more process and mechanism-based investigations. So I was wondering if you could guide us through, the thinking behind these shifts. And maybe also refer to the advantages and weaknesses of each of the approaches.
I could give an entire lecture on this question. In fact, I could talk for a month on this question, but nobody wants me to talk for a month. I could say probably three things of interest, some of them more general, some of them more personal. From a general point of view, in the 1960s, when I was trained in political sociology, most of the students were in some way or another influenced by Marxism. Even those of us who were not Marxists still adopted a structural point of view that was heavily influenced by Marxism. That approach came to a crisis in 1968 because many of us felt that the movements of 1968 were going to lead to revolutionary change. And when it didn't lead to revolutionary change, there was a great disillusionment. Many people gave up studying movements altogether. Many of us moved into institutional pursuits. Many of us, some of us, even became anti-Marxists, which was the case, I think, for a number of Latin American scholars. What I think was mistaken in that trajectory was that our expectations for revolutionary change were exaggerated. We never saw the kind of revolutionary change that we imagined. And it was unrealistic to expect revolutionary change because societies move very slowly. And societies sometimes appear to be moving much more quickly than they are. So this is the first line of caution that I would suggest for Chileans who found themselves overwhelmed by the 2011 student movement. Don't expect too much, because if you do, you're going to be disappointed. So that's at a more general level. At a more personal level, I found, as I did my research, that I was far more interested in the processes of interaction among different social and political actors than I was in the underlying structural causes of those actions. I found that in my work, I was interacting with political and social actors, and I was trying to see things from their point of view. And the more I interacted with these actors, the more I came to believe it was the process of interaction that was driving the change that they were engaged in. And I guess the third reason is a personal one. When I was a young assistant professor, I came into contact with Charles Tilly, who was one of the greatest social scientists in American history and in European history as well. And he influenced my own development very strongly. In the 1990s, I got to know him personally, and we began to work together. And he once said something which summed up his approach that influenced me a great deal. We were taking part in a conference with one of the great structuralist social scientists, Theda Skocpol. I'm sure you know the name. And Theda Skocpol was criticizing the work that Tilly was doing because he gave insufficient attention to the why of social change. And he gave too much attention to the how of social change. When Tilly responded to her, he responded very sweetly, very gently, but he said, "Theda, I want to tell you, how is why. How is why." And that influenced me very strongly to look at the how of social interaction rather than attempting to understand the long-term structural sources of change. Now, you asked me to describe my trajectory, but you also indicated that you would be happy if I criticized it. And here is the criticism, the self-criticism, what we used to say when I was a quasi-Marxist, autokritika. Here is my autokritika, that the attachment to understanding the how of social movements focused inevitably on interactions within the political system. And it tended to leave out the really strong structural changes that underlie political change. And that takes us to the crisis of the current period. It takes us to the period that began, at least in the United States and Europe, in 2008, with a great financial crisis, and with the way it spread around the world. And if we look at many of the movements of the last few years in Latin America, in Western Europe, in the Arab world, and in the United States itself, we find a direct influence of this crisis. So if I had to criticize, it would be to say, yes, how is why, but it's also important to understand how we get to the how of social change. And that takes us back to structural change.
That would also maybe allow us to see the connections between different movements across the world. I mean, there are some structural, like, underpinning conditions that are there and are similar in the emergence of different movements. Jeff Goodwin and a colleague of his recently published a chapter in which they criticize actually, the virtual absence of any research on how capitalism, shapes the possibilities and constraints of social movements, especially in the U.S. Do you agree with this assessment? And do you think that this focus on processes and mechanisms might have contributed to this absence of the world capitalism and of that focus of study?
So this may get a little bit abstract and vague and difficult to explain in a few minutes. What I would say is it's not so much the absence of attention to capitalism that's the problem. The problem is the absence of trying to understand the macro processes that lead to social change. When we look back at Marx, we think of Marx as a structuralist. But if we look carefully at Marx, Marx was actually looking at a number of different processes. For example, proletarianization, which was a key concept in Marx, is a process. Appropriation and exploitation, these are processes. If I had to engage in a discussion with a Marxist today, I would not say Marxism is wrong. What I would say is that Marxists and those who are influenced by them were insufficiently attuned to the processes within capitalism and to the linkage between these processes and the how of social movements. Let me quote, or at least cite, Tilly once again. Tilly wrote a book that I don't think is well known in Latin America about inequality. And it was a book that used a mechanism and process approach to understand inequality. And that's the kind of work I think we should be doing. I don't think we should neglect the how and turn back to the larger structural changes that we know of from 100 years of research. I think we should investigate the processes within capitalism and their translation into the mechanisms of social change.
Going back to the relationship between social movements and institutions, Ring, that is at the heart of your scholarly contribution. We've seen, across the world that there is political disenchantment and that social movements emerge and start to, dispute political representation. I mean, in the Latin American context, you have a lot of indigenous movements that have come into power. In Bolivia, for instance, you have, recent dynamics in Spain, for instance, where Podemos has, emerged as a very strong political force. Do you expect more movement parties to emerge, in the near future? And also, do you think that the relationship between social movements and political parties specifically have been sufficiently theorized from the social movement theory field?
So, if I could begin with your last question, because it's the easiest one. The answer is no. The relations between social movements and parties has not been sufficiently theorized or sufficiently studied. It tends to have been studied in a reductionist way. Scholars, ever since Michel's, have seen social movements being transformed into institutions through a process of institutionalization. That's one of the possible outcomes, but there are another set of outcomes that are possible. And I think we need to study these interactions rather than assume a linear reductionist process of institutionalization. Let me say a little bit also about the indigenous movements in Latin America. I'm not a scholar of these movements, but I do sit on a number of dissertation committees of students who have been fascinated by indigenous movements. And one of the things I think we need to be careful about is specifying what we mean when we talk about indigenous movement parties. These can be very different. In Bolivia, for example, the MAS has very clearly been brought into power by an indigenous movement. But when we look at Ecuador, it's a very different situation. We have an indigenous movement which from a distance looks very similar to the Bolivian movement, but in fact it is virtually absent from the government.
And has been rather the opposite.
It has been on the outside. So many of these movements did arise at the same time, and they did give an impulse to political and social change, but the actual results have been different. And this takes us back to my old friend of the how. This takes us back from the why to the how. The why is clear when we look at the origin of these indigenous movements. The how is what happens after they emerge, And that varies from country to country, and sometimes it varies even within the same country.
And across a particular movement?
Even across a particular movement.
Having moved back to Chile quite recently, coming from the UK, I confirmed a little bit the differences that there exist between different scholarly traditions there and here with regard to the study of social movements. And here in Chile, Latin America in general, of course, on the one hand, the Marxist tradition was very strong at some point, then the new social movement theory, of course. And then authors like Chantal Mouffe, who was recently here in Chile, and Laclau, etc. And there again it strikes me, the absence of those of the influence of those authors in the North American social movement scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
And you on the other hand, you studied the communist, the Italian Communist Party, and knew very well about the influence of Gramsci and on their party, but also more generally in Italian social sciences. How do you explain, that these theories don't travel very easily to the North American context?
Well, there's a simple answer, although it's an inadequate one, and that's North Americans, except for the Quebecois, don't study foreign languages, or at least they don't study foreign languages seriously enough. Because when they travel around the world, everybody speaks English. And so it's so much easier not to read those languages, and it's so much easier not to try and understand those cultures.
But these works are translated, though.
These works are translated, but you need to be able to breathe the culture to some extent in order to understand the works and to take them seriously. For example, Gramsci is read in the United States. He's read in translation. He is profoundly misunderstood by most American scholars. I'm not going to say anything about Chantal Mouffe, but by most North American scholars, he's profoundly misunderstood because he was absorbed into the canon of American social science during a period when culturalism was in vogue. And Gramsci was interpreted as a cultural Marxist. Well, he wasn't a cultural Marxist. As a matter of fact, he was a political Marxist. He was far more attuned to politics than other Marxists at the time, and it misunderstands him if it sees him as a cultural theorist. The other thing I think that's important in understanding the absence of European and South American influences in the United States is the sense of cultural hegemony that most American scholars have. They are trained to believe that their world is the center of the world, economically, politically, and culturally. And therefore they don't take these other cultures as seriously.
But in your view, I remember when the Occupy Wall Street movement was going on and all the discussions that emerged from that moment. I remember, part of what people were arguing was that the movement hadn't achieved any, concrete policy result, but that it had, changed conversation. So I was wondering, maybe these theories could help us to shed light on, discursive dynamics and the way in which social movements contribute to change conversations. What is your view on?
So, I don't know if you know the expression, the canary in the coal mine.
No.
It's an expression we use. The origin of the expression is that coal miners would sometimes put a canary in their hats. And the reason was because the canary could sense poison gases before the miners could, so that they would know to leave the mine. So for many people, the Occupy movement was the source of the change in conversation. For me, the Occupy movement was the canary in the coal mine. Those changes were already afoot. The Occupy movement was a symptom of the changes. So I don't think the Occupy movement changed the conversation, but the conversation did change. And it was already changing when the Occupy movement came out, and I think that was a result of the crisis of 2008 plus, where inequality came to the center of the discussion.
But on a related note, do you think we have sufficient analytical tools to analyze discourses? And what do you see as maybe the main weaknesses of collective action theory, collective action frame theory in this regard? What are the...
So let me, with apologies, recommend that you look at a book I published last year. It's called The Language of Contention. It's not translated into Spanish yet, although I hope it will be eventually. And in it I try to use a kind of discourse analysis that is related to the political process. I identify two kinds of processes that are present when we see a particular language of contention diffuse and sustain itself. These two processes are what I call strategic modularity and symbolic resonance. If we look carefully at most of the work on discourse analysis, it occupies itself with symbolic resonance. And this is natural because the originators of discourse analysis came from linguistic theory. So it was natural that they would look at symbolic resonance. What discourse analysis seems to ignore, in my opinion, is the second process, which I call the strategic modularity. By strategic modularity, I mean the adoption of different discourses because they are strategically valuable in different contexts. And I look at the durability of different discourses because they are strategically valuable in those movements. When we look, for example, at the Occupy movement, we see that it uses a set of concepts, some of which are durable, but others of which have vanished very quickly. The concept of the 99% makes intuitive sense to Americans, so it has symbolic resonance, but it is striking how that discourse has disappeared from the public conversation because it doesn't have strategic modularity. And I think when we look at discourse analysis, we need to try and bring it together with a concept like opportunity structure, which most discourse analysts have failed to do.
I actually read the book, and I was going to ask you about that. I mean, I do think though that maybe not the 99%, but the whole framing around we against the corrupt business elite or elite in general do have that strategic modularity that you refer to. I mean, you see that same framing or a version of that framing in the Indignados movement or in other movements across the world. Do you think that? But you were saying that you actually think that it doesn't have the strategic modularity.
I apologize, first of all, for assuming that you haven't read everything I've written, which is it's a sign of my own modesty. I didn't realize anybody in Chile had actually read that book. Most people in the United States haven't read it either. So, in answer to your question, though, I think the general inequality discourse has what we call legs. It travels. But we need to be careful at assuming that because a common discourse appears in different places in the world, that it's the result of diffusion. It may be the result of diffusion, but it may also be the result of common structural causes in different parts of the world. So when my students look at the inequality discourse in Europe, and they look at the inequality discourse in the United States, they immediately make the assumption that there was a diffusion from the United States to Western Europe. In actual fact, many of these themes arose spontaneously in Western Europe out of the same structural causes of inequality. And this is one thing that I think the students of today need to pay more attention to, the difference between horizontal diffusion of a discourse and common structural sources of a discourse arising in different places in different ways.
How could we, go about researching that if there is a horizontal diffusion taking place or not? I mean, how would you, in terms of research strategy, recommend?
I think in terms of research strategy, there would be no substitute for talking to the actors on their own. And this leads me to probably a question you haven't asked, and that is the excessive reliance on the internet of students today. When we only look at internet messages, what we're seeing is what you might call the froth on top of the waves of social change. Without person-to-person contact with the actual actors, it's very difficult to understand where different discourses come from and their cross-fertilization. So if I were a student today trying to understand, for example, the links between the 2006 Pinguinos movement and the 2011 university student movement, I would not be satisfied looking at the actual discourse I found in the websites and in social media. I would feel it necessary to talk to the actual actors to determine where those ideas come from.
Another question on a different topic. There's a recent book, I don't know if you've come across it, Rich People's Movement.
Yes?
Yeah, which is very interesting. And I was wondering, it's a book on, how rich people's movement mobilized not that rich people, to promote their causes. And it really sheds light on current discussions in Chile, because I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there have been accusations that the right is mobilizing certain, parents groups to oppose the education reforms that are taking place or are being discussed at least. Should we be studying rich people's movement more? I mean, could we social movement scholars make maybe a bigger contribution to, the understanding of current political dynamics if we actually interiorize or shed light on these movements that actually are very influential? So
this is another question that could be answered in a week or a month or a year. First of all, I share the feeling that's implicit in your question that we spend much too much time studying progressive movements and not reactionary or status quo movements.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is obvious. People who study social movements generally come from a progressive background, and many of them have been in social movements of the left themselves. And so for them, studying social movements is at least partly autobiographical. They study the movements that they feel sympathy with, and they don't feel sympathy with the right. The second answer is that we do have a certain number of studies of non-progressive movements. Some of them have been carried out by people who come from a Catholic background, who are themselves interested in conservative movements, but others are not. Clifford Bobb, for example, who is a scholar in the United States, did a wonderful study of transnational conservative movements. And he was reacting against the popularity of books like Margaret Keck and Catherine Sickink's Activists Beyond Borders, which is entirely occupied with progressive or liberal movements. He was reacting against this not because he was opposed to those movements, but because when he looked around the world, he saw a lot of conservative movements. My third answer, I think, is the most complicated and would require a longer discussion, and that is conservative movements don't look the same as progressive movements. Leaving aside reactionary movements like fascism or Nazism, Conservative movements tend to operate outside of the public arena. They tend to operate through organized groups and associations. And this is why, to give myself another boost, this is why I prefer the concept of contentious politics. Because the concept of social movements tends to narrow our attention to the kind of groups that are liberal or progressive. And it tends to take our attention away from the kind of groups that use what we might call more subliminal actions. I'm teaching a course in the spring in the Cornell Law School on law and social movements. And one of the topics we're looking at is the conservative legal movement in the United States. Now, if you look at the conservative legal movement, you will not see people marching in the street. You will not see people using political propaganda or even lobbying. What you will see is a 20-year or more process of successful change in the American legal system, which has taken root through a number of law-abiding conservative institutions by men and women in ties and jackets and dresses who look just like everybody else, who don't march in the street, but who have been gradually organizing within the infrastructure of American society to transform the legal system. And if you look at the composition of the federal court system in the United States, you will see the extraordinary success that this movement has had without anybody knowing that it existed as a movement. So in answer to your question, I think we need to pay attention to movements on all sides of the political spectrum, but we need to change our approach. We need to broaden our approach to look at contentious politics more generally.
What do you think that we can learn, or European scholars working on social movements can learn from the Latin American experience with austerity, economic crisis, etc.? In terms of the social discontent and the articulation of social discontent and the emergence of movements against austerity that actually emerged in Latin America in the 80s and 90s.
Well, I'll repeat what I said before. I'm not an expert on Latin America, and this is the first time I've ever been south of Quito, so I cannot pretend to give advice to Europeans or Americans about Latin American crises. I guess what I would have to say is that I think the biggest lesson for European countries from the Latin American experience is that it's always a mistake for progressive parties to come to power and to adopt neoliberal solutions. It sometimes seems very tempting for left-wing parties to oppose conservative governments by criticizing their neoliberal policies. And this appeals to an electorate. It makes sense to an electorate because neoliberal policies always hurt the majority of the population. The problem is that when many of these governments come to power, they then look around them for experts to consult, and the experts are usually economists, and these economists usually advise neoliberal solutions. And my friend and colleague Ken Roberts has written about this, and he's used the American expression bait and switch, which means, roughly speaking, you bait the support of popular movements to support you, and then once you get to power, you switch from a progressive to a neoliberal policy. That's always a mistake. And when we look at the cases of governments being overthrown in Latin America and political party systems being disrupted, usually the source is a left-wing party that comes to power and adopts neoliberal solutions. Europeans can learn from this if Europeans would listen to the experience of Latin America, For example, the country that I know the most about, which is Italy, had exactly the same experience as many Latin American countries where a progressive government came to power and adopted neoliberal solutions. Not only were they thrown out of power, but the entire party system was disrupted, and a new populist party appeared out of nowhere and suddenly gained 35% of the vote. I guess that would be one of the things to learn. And the more broad issue is to study Latin American populism, where there's a long experience of populism going back to Vargas and Perón that European countries now seem to be experiencing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.